Hi and welcome. You found yourself at Postscript, and I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and we get together like this about every month as part of a program that we do here in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, called Transition Talks, where we bring speakers from around the world to come and talk about the extraordinary kind of change that's going on in the world these days. We're just 100 miles down the road from Washington and Baltimore, and in our little resort town, we bring folks who talk about the emerging new human and the new world that's coming along. We're living in a period of time that has more change, in my opinion at least, than any time in all of history. And so it's an extraordinary period to be in and to try to understand what's going on. And so we're pleased to have all these wonderful folks that come by here, and our guest this week is Gregg Braden. Our friend Gregg Braden is a New York Times best-selling author. He's been nominated for the Templeton Prize. He travels all over the world, has published all kinds of books, and he's a wonderful man, and we're happy to have you with us.
John, I am thrilled to be here with you today, and I just want to take a moment. First, I want to thank our viewers for supporting Postscript, because it's really important to have this format in an era where there's so much misinformation and disinformation that's being distributed. It's important to have a format where we are honest, truthful, and factual about the time that we live in and the changes that are unfolding in our lives. And very, very few places to have that. So thank you for supporting, and John, thank you for your vision and making this possible.
And thank you for coming back and visiting us.
I love being here. I love Berkeley Springs.
Yeah. Well, we talk as I suggested about the emerging new world and the new human being, and you talk about a lot about the new human being. So maybe you can kind of set that up and tell us what you think.
Sure. You know, our world is changing, and I think no one is disputing that fact. There was a time that they were, and I think everyone knows something's up. It's no longer business as usual. And as I travel the world, I've been on every continent except Antarctica. I haven't been there yet, but I've been on every continent of the earth. Not every nation, but every continent. And people I talk to, from government officials and religious officials to scientists, engineers, architects, everyday people, even in villages in the Andes in Peru, and monks and nuns in the monasteries of Tibet, everyone acknowledges that something very, very different, something very unusual is happening. And now that we've gotten through that hump of accepting or denying that something's happening, that the questions are very similar. What can we do to make things better for ourselves, for our families, and what do these changes mean? Where are they going? Is it a speed bump in the road of life and everything goes back to normal, or is there truly a change that is in the presence of this change? Everything that we've known in the past is changing as well. We won't have anything to go back to, and these are the questions that they're asking.
Well, you're obviously onto it, because if you look across the spectrum, you've got broad-based fundamental change in almost every place that you look. And whether it has to do in geopolitics or local politics or in science or in the environment or in energy, it's an exponential curve going into a space, the likes of which we've never seen before. And the interesting thing about that, as you understand quite well, is that you can't make really effective sense out of this emerging new world from the perspective of the old world. And so understanding where this is going and how you get from here is just the name of the game.
Well, it is. You know, I think one of the symptoms that I'm seeing, and I think it's what we're seeing in our lives right now, is there seems to be a resurgence and a greater emergence of hate in the world, that people are trying to separate from the changes that are going on. And whether it's hate based upon the color of our skin or our sexual orientation or our religious preference, the atrocities that you see on the battlefield halfway around the world, and you can say that from wherever in the world you are, to the atrocities that we're seeing in our inner cities and that people are doing to their own kind. People try to separate these. And the common denominator for me, I'm a systems thinker. I'm a geologist by degree, scientist by background, systems thinker. And when you look at the symptoms that are happening, what we begin to see very quickly is that all of these are only possible because of the way we've been taught to think. And if we're trying to solve the problems by imposing solutions upon a system that's based in something that's not true, if you're trying to solve your problem through lies of science, for example, this is where we get a lot of pushback, because these are where the experts will say, you know, we must do these things, but we don't see any reason to make that change. So my experience is that when the facts are clear, the choices become obvious, and there is generally a tendency, once people see what's happening, and they say, well, my God, you know, of course, now we understand why these changes are happening, then they begin to go through the logical process of what do we need to do to accommodate the change. That's not what's happening in the world now. We've got power structures, governments, organizations, trying to tell populations what to do, but they've never shared with, and many of them don't know, they've never shared why the need is for these changes, and that's where we're getting a lot of the pushback.
Well, the thing all hangs on what the facts are, and of course that's a moving target by definition in this kind of sense. And so if you know anything about the history of science, what you know is everything just keeps changing as they update it. And so the notion that you can kind of define a box and say this is the way it is just antithetical to being able to get from here to there.
Precisely. No, I am a scientist. I believe in the scientific method. Science is good. Science does not have all the answers right now, but to a large degree, John, the modern world, science has been hijacked by politicians, corporations, religious institutions, and alternative agendas, trying to cherry pick information in the science to convince people to think or live or believe in a very certain way. Science can only serve us if we keep it honest. And so I think our job, by design, science is meant to be constantly updated. It's not a static view of the world. So when we look at climate, for example, take a snapshot of climate for the last 100 years ago, and you see that the climate is changing. It doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, but that is the way that many of those changes are being interpreted. Climate change is a fact. And we've been saying this for 30 years.
Yeah, well, it's always the fact.
It is a fact, and I want to talk more about that in this conversation. But the point for me is, and what I found is really important, is that if we really want to serve the global community, the way to do that is to give people the information to help them think differently about themselves and their relationship to the world in the big picture of what's happening. So as a systems thinker, as a geologist, I tend to look at the big picture, and the big picture is that we are, in fact, living this convergence of natural rhythms and natural cycles. Climate is only one of those cycles. We're also living a convergence of economic cycles. And everyone, and economics, when I say that, sometimes people get a little uncomfortable. It doesn't mean money. Economies can be about money, but economies are about people and the way that people share the vital resources that they need in their lives: food, water, energy, medicine, communication, security. I've been with communities where there is no money exchanged, and they have very, very robust economies. So we are living the convergence of an economic cycle, a portion of a climate cycle, but the one that really has taken people by surprise, and I shared this, I did a talk at the United Nations a few years ago. We're living the convergence of a cycle of human conflict as well. And when you bring all of these together, human conflict and human economies and natural cycles of climate, all of which impact the way we live, now we're talking about a recipe for change. When I share in a live audience, when I can share, whether I'm talking to government officials or religious officials, or when we were at the UN, I was there with Dr. Bruce Lipton, and we co-presented this. Once people see that big map, that big picture, they say, my God, all of a sudden it makes sense that the unsustainable ways of thinking and living must break down to give way to new ways of thinking and living in the presence of this change, because the environment that we have been living in, I'm not just talking about the climate, but the way, the conditions under which we've been living, as they change, we've got to have new ways of thinking and living. And once they see that convergence of the cycles, it's like this light bulb goes off. Most people don't know that. My mom is a perfect example. when I could still communicate with her. She is in late stage dementia now, I cannot. But she used to say something to me, and I know what she meant. She would say, Greg, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, which is an old term, and I still don't get the handbasket part, but I know what she meant. By the way, we have a studio audience here, so you're hearing that. So it meant to her like the world was coming apart at the seams for no apparent reason, and that is scary. Yeah. But when you see that what looked like random change, actually there's an order to it, and it doesn't go on and on and on forever. It is a change to accommodate a higher form of order. It is chaos breaking down, giving way to a higher form of order, or a better way to say that, we go through the chaos. What we see, the breakdown, that's the chaos. The chaos is necessary in nature to give way to a higher order. And I believe it's happening in our personal lives. I believe it's happening to us collectively. It's certainly happening between nations.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And that old order is the thing that's given us all the problems and all of the issues and all that we have now. And so as things change, what it does is threaten that old order. So all of the kind of the moving parts and the individuals and the organizations and institutions find that extraordinarily threatening, because everybody's looking for continuity so that you can get planning, right? So
you
can
static model. They want to keep everything just as it's been.
So it's got fundamentally changed to be this open, kind of permeable, open way in which you see the incoming kind of options and possibilities, because essentially humanity's being driven into a corner to allow you to jump up to the next level.
But if we don't know that, I'm just going to give a perfect example of how this is playing out. We now live on a planet with, we're pushing pretty close to 8 billion people, 7 and some change. 8 billion people, to the best of our knowledge, we've never had that before. But what makes us so very different is we are globalizing the planet. So we are pushing those 8 billion people, pushing them together. Through their individual ways of thinking and living, we're being asked to assimilate 8 billion people, and that means the religions, different ways that men think about women, different ways women think about men, different forms of sexual beliefs. I mean, all of the political beliefs, we're being asked to come together and globalize across borders and oceans and mountain ranges that used to be the barriers in the past. But we're being asked to accommodate the change through the thinking of the past that's based in separation. So we're being asked to come together in unity based in a thinking of separation. And this is a beautiful example of where the old ways of thinking no longer serve us.
And of course, that's one of the prime characteristics of this new human, is this change in perspective that starts to say that it's not just me and you and separation, it's also about abundance and any number of other kind of things, but there's a whole fundamental mindset. There's a paradigm change, a paradigmatic shift that's happening here.
It is, and it's based upon the way we've been taught to think. So I come back to this time and time again. I mean, you can go through and make yourself crazy trying to change the way people think about climate, or the way they think about gun control, or the way they think about healthcare, or the way they think about, whatever it is. Those are little tiny pieces. They're symptoms of this deeper thinking. And when we get to the bottom of that thinking, and here's the deal, the modern world, since about 1859, the time of Charles Darwin, who introduced a book in 1859, it was titled Origin of Species.
Right.
And he introduced an idea at that time. In his book, the actual words are survival of the strongest. It was later changed to survival of the fittest, but his actual words were survival of the strongest. I get pushback on that, but survival of the strongest. His ideas are so fundamental in terms of the way we're trying to solve our problems that young people ask me in the audiences all over the world, they say, okay, Greg, we get maybe Darwin, 1859 was a long time ago. Maybe he wasn't right, but who cares? What difference could that possibly make in today's world of the internet and high tech and everything? It's a really good question, and the answer surprises people. But the answer is this: the foundations of our society were being created. We were laying the foundation of modern society, late 1800s, early 1900s. Darwin was a scientist. His his theory was so readily and quickly adapted without question that it became embedded in the foundation of our society. So our economic system is based upon competition, his idea of competition, survival of the strongest. Our corporate system, even the way it's so deeply embedded in our way of thinking. And I know most young people, when I asked this question, I said, how many of you remember when you were a kid, you were told survival of the strongest, you were told you live in the dog-eat-dog world and you've got to go out there and fight tooth and nail for everything that's yours. And you know, people, we laugh and say, oh yeah, we remember that. But this plays a very powerful role in how we solve our problems and the kind of world that we are building to adapt to the change. The good news is the best science of the 20th and now the 21st century have overturned 150 years of scientific thinking, beginning with Darwin's ideas. And what they're telling us very clearly is nature is based upon a model of cooperation. Competition obviously happens. I'm not going to deny that that competition is there, but here's the deal. And when we talk about competition, it's not like a friendly game of checkers, you know, or soccer or something. This is violent competition. The greater the degree of violent competition, the further we have strayed from the natural order and the harmony of the natural world. And because we are functioning within the parameters of this natural world, the farther we move from that harmony, the more problems we create for ourselves. It's true with the health of our bodies, and we're going to talk about this. It's true with the health of our families and our society, the way we solve our problems. So as this couldn't be more beautiful. There's a beautiful symmetry here, John, if we look at the big picture. Natural systems are converging to upset the order that we've come to expect. And what's happening is we now are being forced to change the way that we think to be able to adapt to that new order. And the only way that we can do that successfully is to honor our relationship to the natural world. And this is where the beauty of science, 5,000 years of spiritual traditions and ancient wisdom and indigenous wisdom, they all come together in a really beautiful way to give us a model. And where we get into trouble is my scientific colleagues like to label things. And where we get into trouble is the spirituality doesn't like to hear about technical and science, and the science doesn't want to hear about spirituality, and then you throw in all the baggage with religion and all the other things that go with it. We need a new vocabulary, a neutral vocabulary that helps us to embrace the deep truths of our existence as human to human, without the judgments. And I believe that we're doing that now, and I believe it gives us the evolutionary edge that we've never had to successfully not just survive, but thrive, to transcend and thrive into the new world that's emerging. And that's where we're going to go with this.
It's a whole new mindset that has to emerge, a whole new way of seeing yourself relative to other humans, relative to the larger environment.
Right.
And it only makes sense. I mean, if you buy the kind of as above, so below, the Hermetic kind of principle that seems to be littered all over sets of relationships. What you got to do is go out and look at nature just as a start, and it's obvious that there's not huge competition all the time. Everything lives in and so to my way of thinking, what's emerging is this kind of new, kind of integrated way that starts to look not only horizontally but even vertically into what other life in the cosmos might be and how we relate to it all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're covering a lot of ground here. So what I want to just anchor a couple of concepts of the cycles. And then I want to begin to share the new discoveries that are not making it into the mainstream. You're not seeing mainstream textbooks, classrooms, mainstream documentaries about the human body and the extraordinary potential that we have to self-regulate our biology. And when you begin talking about self-regulating the way that you perceive your world, when you start talking about that in the presence of a world that's changing, you're talking about self-empowerment and a way to thrive rather than being a victim of the change. So you okay? Can we?
Absolutely.
So let me just give an example. We talked about these three cycles: economy, climate, and conflict. And the conflict is probably the one that people have the most questions about. So I just want to say a few words about this. As a geologist, I'm fascinated I remember 1970s, I was working in the energy industry, and I was looking at magnetic maps of our planet and magnetic migration. The poles move, and the strength of the field intensity of the magnetic fields ebbs and flows over time. So I'm looking at these maps, and the magnetic fields are weakening. They are weaker now than they have been. They've been weakening for 2,000 years, but they're weaker now than they have been, in the last 100 years.
Right.
And so my question, I asked my colleagues, I said, what does that mean to us? If those fields are weakening and we live in those fields, now this is 1970s. I said, what does that mean to us? Here's my colleagues. Don't ask me, I'm a geologist.
Yeah,
they said, you have to go ask a biologist. So I asked my biology friends, same thing. They said, we deal with cells. We don't know anything about magnetic fields. And it was a beautiful example of how we've compartmentalized a world that does not live in compartments. Nature doesn't know about chemistry and physics and biology and geology. Nature is a system. We've broken it into these compartments so that we feel comfortable with it. But the new science now is where we cross those traditional boundaries to find out how these systems interact with one another. So this is one of the places. What we now know is that the magnetic fields of the Earth are directly linked to solar cycles, among other things, and that we are in a weakening cycle right now. The sun is becoming very quiet. This is the year 2019. We're at a solar minimum right now. And it's influencing magnetic fields of the Earth. Here's why this is important. The new studies are showing a very powerful relationship that most people are not hearing about. When the magnetic fields of the Earth are strong, we are more cooperative, less aggressive, more willing to work together to help one another and to solve our problems. When the magnetic fields are weak, all of that reverses. When the magnetic fields are weak is when we become more aggressive, less willing to solve our problems. And so here we are, the year 2019 going into 2020, big election cycles, big problems on the Earth, and we find ourselves at a time where it's easy to give in to the urge for competition and conflict. However, as we become aware of our ability to self-regulate, we can change all of that, and I want to talk about that.
Well, absolutely. But you have all these natural things that you brought with you. I don't mean natural in the terms we're talking about, but these historic and things that your parents have told you and society has told you, and they're all at risk at this point. Yep. And that's the essence of how you transit and get into this new space, because what you have to do is be open enough to question the kinds of things that you brought into the room with you, because it's a new space that you're going into.
It's all about, it's our story.
Yeah.
There's an American author, I love his work, his name is Scott Turow.
Yep.
And Scott Turow says very eloquently, he says, who are we? But the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and believe. It's not just what we tell ourselves, it's what we believe to be true. And then you ask, well, where do our stories come from? Where's my story come from?
Where do your belief come from?
My story comes from my family, it comes from my neighbors, from my culture, from the education, what school I went to, my religious upbringing. And some of the story is conscious and a lot of it is subconscious. And this is where we really get into the issues, because our subconscious beliefs have us so deeply rooted in false assumptions of an obsolete science. And the new discoveries have overturned all that. So we ask science to tell us who we are. Science is doing it, and a lot of scientists don't like the answers.
Well, it's an interesting kind of issue, because the question kind of is, who are you becoming? How do you become something new in the face of the kind of the collapse of the infrastructure and the paradigm that you came up with? And how do you deal with all of this extraordinary amount of change? And in the end, we're both going to come around to saying a whole lot of that has to do with how you think about yourself and how you approach this. And we can talk about that in the next segment that we're going to do, because we're out of time now. But it's so nice to have you with us here.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure. Thank you. That time went very quickly, and I look forward to our next.
It goes very quickly. But it's been nice to be with you. And thanks for being with us here on Postscript. Gregg Braden has been our guest, New York Times best-selling author, and a wonderful friend who comes to our little town as part of the Transition Talks series of speakers that we do. And you can find out more about that at transitiontalks.org. And we hope to encourage you to come and be with us. There's a whole wonderful lineup of speakers that we have going all the way into next year. And so we'll be back again next month, and we'll have another segment here to talk with Gregg, and we hope that you'll come with us. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and thanks for being with us.